Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Dissecting Fiction podcast. I'm Vinny Murphy.
I'm Christiaan and
And today we're going to cover a topic rife with controversy.
At least currently, and probably in the future, too.
We're going to talk about Disney's Star Wars. Oh, I'm sure we'll talk about Lucas's Star Wars.
Yeah, but we're trying to narrow this in because this is, even though Disney bought this pretty recently, not even 10 years ago, trying to do the whole Star Wars thing, that's like 40 years of media and history. It's a bit overwhelming, so we kind of want to narrow our focus with this.
Disney's Star Wars right now is probably the most relevant thing to talk about, and obviously we'll touch upon other ones, but let's really start where it starts. October of 2012, Disney purchases Lucasfilm for $4 billion. That's not all cash. There's some stock, and what I think is interesting about this is, this is after Marvel is purchased.
Disney buying Star Wars was kind of like the beginning of the Bob Iger empire, because this is kind of transitioning from post Michael Eisner into Bob Iger. And Michael Eisner was known for expanding his businesses, but Bob Iger was known for kind of expanding franchises.
I think what's interesting, too, is you see, a lot of this criticism come out of, why is Disney buying up these properties? Which, in itself, is a little silly. Disney, once they began to branch out of animation, even when Walt was around, really did go in this direction. You had Zorro, you had Davy Crockett. This type of storytelling, in a sense, has always been part of the DNA of Disney.
Absolutely. You can even look at Walt Disney expanding to the theme parks. When Disney expands into something, they want to make sure they're the dominant force in that field. And it's just interesting to see how the businesses have changed. And the Star Wars being bought out was the beginning of that, because this was such a big deal back in 2012 when this happened, because for years, decades, George Lucas was Star Wars. There was no mixing that up. All of a sudden, it wasn't his anymore.
Which is interesting, because when he did sell Lucasfilm, and a lot of people have said that he sold Lucasfilm because he knew he was going to slow down his production and really move towards retirement, and he wanted to make sure that all these employees that he had continued to have work. Which I think sounds right from everything I've ever heard about Lucas. But he immediately kind of says, we're going to see what happens when Star Wars gets to go into the hands of new creators.
Yeah, which is kind of a weird statement looking back at that now.
But can you blame him? I mean, so much focus was on him for so long that you can criticize Lucas for maybe losing track of things with the success of Star Wars. But he did make Star Wars.
Yeah, he did. But he was always very good about saying, this guy did this guy did that. And even in the 90s, a lot of that stuff was by other creators. And even though his name was in front of it, there was no bones about it. There was a lot of content there made by other people at this point. But Star Wars is kind of like a pope at that point. The Pope of Star Wars. Whatever he said was canon. Whatever he said was, the official Star Wars law.
And you also hear a lot about how at LucasArts and Lucasfilm and any of the other subsidiaries, George was the final word.
Yes.
Regardless of, how much work had gone on without him, the buck stopped there, as it were. So almost immediately after purchasing Lucasfilm, Disney expresses that they will be doing a new trilogy. It has come out that they did, in fact, initially take a look at what Lucas was planning to do, and yes, regardless of how many retractions there was some sort of plan at Lucasfilm for an episode 7, 8, and 9.
Yeah, some of the details that come out, and they're kind of infamous now, especially it's very Body Wars type of stuff. And it was a bit hazy whether or not George Lucas was going to be involved, but pretty quickly they split totally from him.
It sounded like they didn't really want to use his ideas, and he was kind of like, okay. That deal really comes together in October of 2012. In January of 2013, which is not all that much longer, they do officially announce that J.J. Abrams is going to end up as director of the first of the new films and producer on the trilogy.
J.J. Abrams was kind of the perfect choice for this initially, I think. Because even when he was doing Star Trek and things like that, he was you could tell he was very much more of a Star Wars type of guy.
And I believe that Lucas did sign off on that choice, if I remember what I read correctly. We'll talk about if he was the correct choice as we go on. But nonetheless, he was the choice. They also, fairly shortly after that, in February, announced the beginning of the Star Wars anthologies, which are to be films picking smaller stories not directly related to the trilogy. Those would eventually end up being called the Star Wars stories. Then we'll get back to that a little bit too, because that becomes sort of an interesting aspect of this era of Star Wars to a lot of fans and business-wise. Shortly after that, in the spring, they announced Star Wars Rebels. I don't think initially they announced that it's basically a continuation of the Clone Wars cartoon, but eventually that does come out.
I remember watching it as a lot of people were kind of upset the Clone Wars was ending, because the Clone Wars was kind of cherished by fans. But it became pretty quickly evident that Rebels was just Clone Wars 2.
At this point, you start to see maybe where this little desire to get away from the prequel trilogy starts. Is you basically have the same crew from a really successful TV show coming on, but Disney, just until recently, hadn't really embraced the sort of pre-A New Hope Star Wars continuity. They were trying to get away from it because of how much criticism there was on it.
It's so much of the lore is from before A New Hope. Like, that's where most of the lore seems focused on. You do get some, like, post Return of the Jedi stuff, but, like, as a series, it's weird to see, like, a franchise suddenly, like, throw out most of its past. Which is what happened here when Disney bought it out.
You know, there are certain things that were recognized, and this is a good introduction to this idea. As Star Wars started to be produced by Disney, they rolled out this idea of the hard continuity, where there was not really any wiggle room. And obviously all the films were accepted, the Clone Wars was accepted as part of continuity, but all the had to be, if not tens, hundreds of novels that had come out, that had fleshed out a lot of ideas, are all thrown out.
Even video games too, a lot of the like Knights of the Old Republic stuff is suddenly not canon and it's still in a weird limbo, too.
Yeah, there's a lot of times where ideas, especially recently, have been acknowledged as kind of existing, and you don't know how far into those old stories that they're accepting as canon. You know, like things like the Black Sun from Shadows of the Empire, like, exists within the continuity, and there definitely was a guy who looked like Shizor running around, but we don't really have these hard decisions on a lot of the concepts. You know, you have Admiral Thrawn, who once was the post-Return of the Jedi character, is now a pre-Return of the Jedi character, but is in continuity. So it's a lot of stuff that is probably as easily overlooked as the old expanded universe going on. But there's also still a lot of confusion over what's continuity.
Yeah, but I feel like it's a much cleaner break than most other franchises would have, because they just had a very hard, like, anything post Return of the Jedi is not canon, anything pre-Phantom Menace is not canon.
And I would agree with that. I think, you know, probably the biggest loss might have been Shadows of the Empire in there, since it was such a big deal when it came out. But once again, there are elements of that are still floating around.
Yeah, I would have said Knights of the Old Republic, but that's just because of the era I grew up in.
Yeah, I think that has a lot to do with it. Like, if you were around when Shadows of the Empire launched, it was huge. There were toys for a book. It was like the weirdest thing. That's a really 90s. Very, very interesting era. At this point in 2013, Disney is still waiting for a lot of contracts to kind of run out with other companies. Comic books are going to stay at Dark Horse for a while. They actually do a really, really good Star Wars series when they know that this is the last Star Wars series they're probably going to get, and it's pretty cool. I would recommend going back and checking out that last Dark Horse Star Wars series. In May of 2014, they do start letting a lot of information come out about Rogue One. Not initially what the name of it is, but conceptually that this is going to be a movie that takes place before A New Hope. The many creative players involved with that, and we'll get back to that in a little bit. And around the same time, if you want to know how far in advance this is being planned in 2014, they announced Rian Johnson for the movie that will be The Last Jedi, Episode 8. So, you know, we don't get a ton of content from Disney for these first couple of years. It really starts in October of 2014 with Star Wars Rebels premiering on Disney XD. As we said, you know, a continuation of Clone Wars in many ways, but in many ways not. It starts introducing a lot of concepts back into continuity, which I think is probably the most important thing about the show, especially how much it starts to flesh out sort of the remnants of the Jedi and the Sith. if there's something that I really, really like about Disney's continuity is that they kind of dismiss this idea that the Jedi could have completely disappeared. Like, this group of people who are basically defending an entire government. You could almost get the impression in the original trilogy that, like, they just all kind of disappeared. And then this really grounds it in, all right, no, they couldn't completely disappear. It's just you're dealing with isolated characters like a Luke Skywalker who's been intentionally placed away from everything.
Yeah, he lives in the middle of a desert in the middle of nowhere.
And there's just a lot more going on than you got to see in the original trilogy.
Stuff like, how would Luke not know about the Jedi? That's all stuff that kind of emerges in, like, post-trilogy continuity. Because, like, when they start fleshing out the series, you find all these weird plot holes like that.
Yeah, and that's the thing, is I think they're not necessarily plot holes. Like I said, I think part of the strength of the original trilogy is its focus on the characters. And as much of a retcon as it kind of is, I'm sure there was some discussion of this, that, Luke is really being kept away from everything intentionally, too. And Han doesn't care about the Jedi. And you don't really get much commentary from Leia, who might be the one who would know the most.
You can kind of tell from, like, Star Wars, like, the first trilogy, not a lot of it was planned out, not a lot of the lore was planned out or anything. It was just, like, fun action films. And this idea of, like, lore and continuity is something that can only emerge in our current, like, internet-focused era. We have information on, like, literally everything.
Well, I would agree to a certain extent. I think for it to be an element in pop culture, yeah, you're right. I mean, it has existed before that amongst nerds forever. That's always been, I mean, for a long time, that was the sort of unifying factor for, like, big Star Wars fans, is people who actually cared about anything else outside of the movies or, like, thought about how they would function. Now it's so accessible, like, you could listen to a podcast where people talk about it. It changes the nature of it. And I do agree. I think for what Star Wars has become culturally, yes, the last 20 years have been incredibly important as far as technology being able to convey those ideas.
Even though Rebels just premiered, we're already getting all these, like, teasers about, like, a Star Wars every year, which is something that wasn't really a thing before Disney. Like, this idea of Star Wars every single year, that's insane.
Yeah, even Clone Wars was kind of, the aberration from the way Star Wars had usually been done. There had been other animated series, you had the Ewok specials, but for the most part, there was very little on film of Star Wars, even during the Clone Wars trilogy.
It was supposed to be, like, an event anytime these films came out. And it still is, arguably. But the way Disney originally was directing this is very much like, no, we're going to make this a phenomenon, like Marvel Studio.
I think that was their intention, but, we haven't quite gotten to where maybe ideas changed. Early 2015, Marvel gets Star Wars back, technically. They had it in the 70s. Those are well received. They sell pretty well. And up until they just canceled it, Marvel going and canceling them books and relaunching with a new number one again. Star Wars actually was Marvel's longest running series.
Really?
If you want to know how much stuff Marvel cancels, how frequently. Star Wars, which started in 2015, until it got canceled to make room for the new Star Wars number one, was their longest running regular series.
I remember when, like, Star Wars number one came out for Marvel, like, that was the highest selling comic in quite a while, too.
It was, and there was a bit of a controversy about that because every place on the planet had an exclusive cover. I think, like, your grandmother's house might have had an exclusive cover. And you get to, I think the way it works is, like, the direct market will count returns, but if you ship books to, like, GameStop orders 100,000 copies or something, that's it. Like, that gets counted, regardless if all of them are sitting on a shelf somewhere.
Well, they were also including them in, like, loot boxes and things like that.
Yeah, there was all sorts of different... Like, almost any venue for comics had Star Wars number one, and it had its own cover. Yes, it sold incredibly well, and it did sell incredibly well. It was hard to find after that first week. But it's a little bit of a magic trick on that, of how well it sold.
The numbers are definitely fudged.
Yeah. March in 2015, this is where they announced what Rogue One was going to be called, and no one really knew what to think aside from the little bit of information that had leaked out. And then the big thing in 2015, The Force Awakens opens on December 18th. Writing credits on this go to Lawrence Kasdan, J.J. Abrams, and Michael Arndt.
So should we just get straight into it about Force Awakens?
Yeah, let's talk about Force Awakens.
So, I've only watched this movie twice. But I don't want to say, like, I super enjoy it, but I have a good time with it. Because it is, like, I think that has to do a lot with J.J. Abrams' directing. I understand, like, the story gets pretty frayed in the middle. The way J.J. Abrams directs Star Wars, I feel like is very atmospheric. Like, it just feels immersive going to, like, Jakku and seeing all these weird alien designs he has. And it's just kind of very, like, reminiscent of classical Star Wars. He's using puppets. He's not using all these green screen tricks that George Lucas was doing with the trilogy. And like I was saying, the story gets kind of frayed in the middle, especially when they go to Not Mos Eisley, and they're in that market with that...
Takodana Castle.
Takodana Castle, and they have that little alien lady just kind of explaining the Force and everything.
Her name is Maz Kanata. I play a lot of Battlefront 2.
That's where like it kind of falls apart for me, because there you have like Finn saying like, oh, you know, I got here, I'm just running away, you know, and then he runs away. And then Rey's like, no, I'm going to stay. And then she finds Luke's lightsaber. She's like, no, I'm going to run away. And then she comes back. And then Finn comes back too. And all happens in like the span of 15 minutes. Like people decide to like come back and leave and come back and leave. Like Finn's literally getting onto the ship. And then that's when the planet destroyer launches all its lasers, and you're like, did the Republic just get totally wiped out? And then Finn just comes back and is like, oh, we gotta find Rey. It's like, what's happening? And then it kind of just distracts you with a cool action sequence where Finn has the lightsaber.
I'm a little harsher, but with sort of the same points. I would say, visually, especially after, you know, let's be frank, the somewhat stiff directing of George Lucas that we got on the prequels. The first, 15 minutes of The Force Awakens, I was super excited.
Yeah.
There was mystery. You had things going on at night, which was really cool. And, you laugh, but, the truth is, part of the reason for that is, how much special effects have advanced. Those shots would have been impossible, even to do, an 80s version of.
Well, they had those nice shots in Revenge of the Sith where...
Oh, jeez. Anyway. So we get, what seems to be this really visually better designed film. And I don't think there's been a single Star Wars film where production, costume design were bad. I think that, if anything, that has been the most consistently well done thing across the board. Even the designs from the prequel trilogy, which gets a lot of criticism, I think are really cool.
I think sometimes they get a little uninspired, not in the trilogy series, but
But I think there's at least, there was consistency to it.
Oh, yeah.
The problems in Force Awakens all start when they just kind of keep introducing characters, and instead of a mystery being revealed, you just kind of realize that it seems like no one knew what was going on.
It's very strange, but yeah, because it's by the time they're actually attacking the base, it feels very, slapped together. This is not, this overarching force, and I say it's also a problem with, how I think Disney was imagining this film, because a lot of it is just kind of vaguely explained. And, you get to stuff like the First Order. They don't explain what the First Order is, but they have a book where you can buy it and you get to know about the First Order, but you have to buy all 10 of the books to really get to know what the First Order is, because the first book is just, gobbledygook.
That's, a huge problem for me, not only narrative-wise, but, emotionally, is, alright, this is supposed to be 30 years after Return of the Jedi. What the hell happened? Why do I care about any of these characters running around? And in that, that first sequence, you don't have to tell me. I see that there are clearly stormtroopers. I see that this guy who looks like he's in rebel gear is on the run. But you never get anything close to an explanation of what's going on outside of the fact that you know this is the First Order is kind of the Empire, and you know that the Resistance is kind of the Rebellion, and you don't know why the Return of the Jedi was meaningless.
Yeah, it's because I was thinking about watching it. It's in the original trilogy, they don't really explain anything either, but it's so based in these archetypes that you kind of know what's going on. They're fighting the evil king, and I don't want to say king, but I'm using king in the vague archetype sense.
And I think, you pull out a good point there. You don't want to mistake deliberate, simple plot with poor plot. Because in the original trilogy, yeah, they don't get too into how the Empire formed. They don't get into the specifics of the rebellion. But at bare minimum, you know the stakes.
Yeah.
You know that this is the Empire that is running everything. They're evil. They need to be stopped. Here are the guys that are going to stop them. You can't do that in movie 7. Like, you can't.
It actually is movie 7
It is movie 7. And not only is it movie 7, the trilogy that precedes it is literally 3 movies of exposition. That's where that's the weakest. That's part of the reason that, like, the prequel trilogy, rightfully so, is criticized. And the biggest problem with it is you have a bunch of characters who you either know are going to survive or are irrelevant. And it makes the movies kind of boring. But you get a ton of world building, and you get a ton of stuff that other people have taken, for example, in Clone Wars, and made into something really, really cool just by putting that element of character and surprise back into it that it was missing. The Force Awakens is like the opposite. It's all these characters doing things for the entire movie, but you have no idea why. And by the end of it, you're kind of like, why did they just do all the same stuff they did in A New Hope?
I was thinking about this when they were talking about Luke. Like, we have to find Luke Skywalker. And it's really like, why? Like, what is he going to bring to the rebellion? Because now there's a second rebellion. Because apparently the whole government is shut down, is not able to deal with the First Order. Why is Luke in this case so important? I get that he's like a knight. He's the Luke Skywalker. But what specifically is it going to bring?
Right. If this all failed anyway, then what did Luke Skywalker do? Which is funny, and I want to touch upon this because I did a little research. It's actually something I didn't know until I decided to dig into this further, is the actual explanation in Star Wars continuity now of what happened. And I'm going to paraphrase it and make it really simple, so I apologize to anyone who's listening who went through the books and knows all these little details to it. But the basic progression is supposed to be the New Republic forms. It's kind of a mess, which a new government would be. That's fair. Mon Mothma was running the government, and then I believe she gets sick and has to retire. They're looking for a new leader. At the same time this is going on, Leia gets word that the First Order is out there somewhere, and she's trying to encourage everyone to kind of like build up their defenses, but no one's really listening to her. They're not taking her seriously. She's about to take over the government, Leia that is, and then anti-Leia propaganda pops up, all centered around the fact that Darth Vader is her father. And then she's not able to take over the government, and then has to start the quote-unquote resistance to defend against this First Order that no one believes is coming back.
In the abstract, that all makes sense, but then you get into stuff like the First Order was kidnapping children and, like, brainwashing them.
That's like, how much territory did they have?
Like, how they just emerge all of a sudden, like, this is all kind of, like, lore minutia, but it feels very important in the film itself, which is odd. And I think it's because it's so heavily rooted in the original trilogy, because it's constantly calling back to that. And it's trying to feel like it's expanding on that, but it doesn't feel like it's actually expanding on it.
No, and I totally agree with that, and I think that's where, we said we get back to this, I think that's Abrams' weakness, is Abrams visually, and to a certain extent with screenplays, understands what happened before. I don't think there was any real idea of where to go, or one that was more than we have to restore what people didn't see in the prequel trilogy. That's what that movie feels like. The Force Awakens feels like, hey, this isn't the prequels. When now that we're, a decade out from the prequels, pretty much? The prequels have actually gained all of this sort of gravity because of Clone Wars, because of all the thought people have put into the Jedi Order. And I think it was a miscalculation of how the stories remained successful even through that criticism.
I think that's just, like, a way kind of lore functions. Like, a lot of that stuff gets built on much later on, and I think A Force Awakens is a very good jumping off point. It does feel like Force Awakens is very much, like, a criticism of the prequel trilogy in that, like, there's a lot of action sequences, but they don't feel overproduced. You don't have, like, 100 lightsabers all of a sudden in a coliseum they're fighting, like, bug monsters. But at the same time, I think the reason the prequels are so, I don't want to say revered, but they're now kind of like treated more kindly because of all that lore, is because the lore has had time to develop over 10 years. And I think A Force Awakens creates a very good launching pad for all this lore to develop. I do also think they introduce good characters to start out with. I think they picked very good actors to like bring a lot of emotion to these characters, which I didn't really recognize the first time around when I watched this. And I think it gets lost in translation later down the line. But you do see a lot of cool like character moments with these characters.
I would agree on the characters. with the exception of how Finn ends up getting played, where he starts off completely motivated by being a pacifist and then is just slaughtering people 5 minutes later. But
or wanting to leave and then coming back right away.
Right. There are issues. And I don't think there's any problem with the cast at all. If there's anything I do really like out of the Disney trilogy is Kylo Ren. I think he's kind of cool from the beginning, and I know there was a lot of like joking about like emo Darth Vader, but he's a petulant child. Like, that's fine. Like, that's a cool idea to have. It's not terribly far from Vader, first of all. And it would make sense.
That's a good point.
It makes sense if, you have this like gung-ho, almost like fundamentalist version of the Empire, that would be like your zealot leader.
Yeah, the people literally worshipping Darth Vader and things like that. And Kylo Ren is probably like the breakout character out of this. I know Finn and Rey get a lot of criticism, but I think that's just because like they have to deal so much with like playing off of Han Solo and Leia and everything that you don't really get to see all their strengths. This
right here, I'm going to make the statement, is where I completely disagree with you. You were talking about like having time for lore to develop around the story and having like a starting point. I don't think Force Awakens holds as much weight as the prequel trilogy, and I'll tell you why. The prequel trilogy, as you said, like completely throws out characters and does all this world building. But what it also does is establishes a lot of ethics to the characters, establishes a lot of themes that are going to play off each other. I think that's what Force Awakens is missing, and I think it's so difficult to recover from that, and we'll get into that a little more as we go into the projects that follow it in the timeline. I think Force Awakens did a huge disservice to the future of the story. I think it makes it so hard to expand on it because all you have are those sort of like little character moments and the action sequences, and you don't have these bigger thematics playing behind it. And that's where you can expand from a lot easier than trying to take characters and then push them into different directions thematically.
I kind of disagree with that, but I kind of agree because there is a theme about like dealing with the past and what the past means to people. But the problem is it's centered around these characters that have no idea about the past. Like, Rey lived in the middle of the desert. Finn literally has been brainwashed his entire life. They don't really have opinions on, like, the First Order or the Resistance or the Republic.
Oh, and Poe Dameron's a really good pilot.
Yeah.
That's his character.
He does not like the First Order.
Oh, no.
But I think that's why, like, Kylo Ren becomes the richest character out of this because he has, even though he doesn't explicitly state any of them, he does feel like he has a lot of opinions on things.
And I agree with you in that because, and even the way he is developed, he's worshipping the skull of Darth Vader. And we know more about Darth Vader than he does.
Yeah.
And that's where you can have an interesting play, but you don't have that with anyone else in The Force Awakens.
Which is weird. You would think you would have Finn with really strong opinions, but the only strong opinion he has is that, like, the First Order is really powerful, we shouldn't fight them. But then that gets immediately reversed. Or that Rey really likes the Jedi, and she likes the Republic lore. But she doesn't really have, like, any ideas about it.
Right.
She doesn't, like, fantasize it in the same way Kylo Ren does.
Or even Luke Skywalker did. Like, there isn't, like, that parallel. Not that we want a lot of parallels, which we got action sequence-wise and set pieces and such. But the other thing that I think has to be mentioned in The Force Awakens is, you have the return of Han Solo, you have the return of Leia, Chewbacca, C-3PO, and R2-D2, who don't really do too much. But
hey, C-3PO has a red arm.
Oh, yes, he has a red arm from a comic book story. I do like that he points out the red arm. That's actually one of the few things that I think is really funny in that movie is, like, C-3PO, like, talking about the red arm and like, oh, you must not recognize me. Yeah. I'll give them that joke. Once I watched the movie, right? And in theaters, I was like a little kinder. But you always need that like 48 hours on any movie to really think about it. Every time I've watched it since then, I'm just like, I don't need Han Solo to show up in this. Like, I don't need him there. And him getting killed is going to be that tie to Kylo Ren. Fine. But it just starts to feel like a little fanfiction-y, like a little more fanfiction-y every time I watch that movie. Like, it's just sort of like, oh, look who they ran into.
Yeah, it gets very kind of messy at that point. I think Han Solo is where, like I said, when they go to not Mos Eisley, that's when it really fades. But that's kind of when you see the tension show up.
And I think it also takes away from Luke at the end of the movie.
I still think that shot with Luke at the end is really cool.
I think that is one of the best things in the movie, but I think it would have been so much more impactful if you had been dealing with characters that weren't associated with, and then someone showed up at the end. Where, like, you know, like, what if the closest thing you got to someone from the original trilogy in that entire movie was Vader's skull? And then at the end, Luke shows up. It's a totally different type of tone. And I think something like that could have helped it. Anyway, it makes a ton of money.
Yeah, it was funny that, like, people were like, $4 billion, that's insane. How would they ever make back that money? And then, like, Force Awakens makes, like, $1.5 billion.
I think they've already made profit on it.
Yeah, they already made profit. Yeah.
So, anyway, Force Awakens is very divisive. I still know a lot of people actually like it. You know, as much of criticism has come down since then, it's still fairly well liked. And then the next year, we get December again, Rogue One: A Star Wars Story, which is basically a direct prequel to A New Hope.
Rogue One is interesting because we never got, like, a weird in-between film like these before that's basically just, like, a connective tissue. And it's also, like, emblematic of what Disney was aiming for in building, like, a franchise out of this. Because they were going to have one big Star Wars film and then next year, like, a smaller Star Wars film. And this is kind of the beginning of all that. You also see, I believe with Rogue One, they fired the director, correct?
No.
I'm thinking Han Solo.
You're thinking Solo. Rogue One is a little more complicated. You know, obviously Disney is pretty tight-lipped on this, but what has come out is the original director, and still remains the director, Gareth Edwards. They had a completed film. They weren't completely happy with it, so they went back and reworked some things. But he was always involved, which I think is a very different sort of thing than what happens later in Solo. It was still his movie. He still promoted a lot of it. And while there were adjustments to it, you know, I think it was a pretty successful piece of storytelling for them.
It was a bit more experimental than most Star Wars films we get, and that is, like, it's a lot darker than most of them.
It's very reminiscent, and this is one of the first times you really see this, and it's starting to happen a lot more, and we'll get into that. Very reminiscent of old EU, you know, where you get that sort of more military focus that you can't really get during the episodes because you're always dealing with the Jedi and the lightsabers and the Force. Like, Rogue One, while it does touch upon that because it is part of the world, goes back to the idea that this is a military rebellion against a giant empire.
Yeah, and that's the aspect I like the most about it, was, like, they talk a lot about military tactics and them planning about how to defeat the Empire and everything.
And there's also a lot of really cool design. You get a lot more... They start to align the Imperial aesthetic more with the Republic, where in, you know, the prequel trilogy, you got to see all sorts of troopers doing all sorts of things. You know, you get hints at that in the original trilogy, but the original trilogy, as we were saying before, is really focused. This basically is one of the first times they show you that, yes, there are all different types of TIE fighters, and there are all different types of troopers for all different types of planets and environments, which, you, like I said, you always had the hint of, but now it's getting fleshed out, and I think design-wise, Rogue One might be one of my favorite Star Wars movies. I mean, it is one of my favorite Star Wars movies, but especially for that reason, that I thought they did a fantastic job of creating both Imperials and Rebels that weren't just one design for each movie, where, like, you felt like, oh man, there's all sorts of stuff going on, and there's all sorts of ships. And I also thought that all the performances were really cool. I thought that it showed a lot of restraint and humor, so when they did have a joke, it landed. I think out of the Disney-produced features, it's absolutely my favorite. And, you know, I've had to think about this a lot. a lot. I might like it better than Return of the Jedi as a movie. I might go Empire, A New Hope, Rogue One, and then Jedi. But I'm not super committed to that. Don't get mad at me. It's definitely a close call for me, though.
See, I like... My favorite part of the sequence is either, like, the first 30 minutes where it's very, like, focused, and then, like, the last hour when they're on the planet trying to actually steal the plans and everything. In between, I don't really care for it as much.
Really? See, I really like it because I feel, to me, out of the features, the only time the rebellion feels like a little gritty, which is what it would have to be to survive, and that's part of the point of the movie, you know, that opening sequence. it hammers home the fact that, like, the Empire is, like, horrible and something has to be done, and there are people who are going to do whatever is necessary to take them down, which is cool because then you can kind of keep that in the back of your head through everything else. And then it's like, you're learning about Luke Skywalker, like, cool traditional hero, but, in the background are all these cool ships and all these spies and all this stuff that allow him to triumph.
A lot of it for me, it was just like, sure, the grit is there, but it was a hard time for me to, like, connect with any of it, because it feels very much, I don't want to say antithetical to Star Wars, but it feels like it's just something kind of, like, parallel to, like, the main focus.
I would agree if you're looking at, and this is an interesting thing, because we're talking a lot about, like, the canon and how that's built. I would agree if you're looking at Star Wars as the story of the Skywalkers, yes. If you're looking at Star Wars as the story of the rebellion, no. I think it's hugely important then. And I think that Vader's appearances in it are justified, which is cool, because I was really worried, like, you hear, like, the rumors of, like, oh, Vader's going to be in this.
Yeah.
It never felt wrong. I'll be the first to admit the first time I saw his castle, I kind of laughed. But now that, like, I've watched the movie, like, a bunch of times, I'm like, this is actually really cool, because it isn't really contradicting anything. And he is kind of flamboyant in a way. Like, it works in my head that he would want a fortress in the place where he got, like, destroyed.
Right, you would want to meditate on that.
Yeah.
Brood on it.
So Rogue One does pretty well. While this is all going on, Colin Trevorrow, who is probably best known for Jurassic World, signs on to be the director of the coming Episode 9. There's a lot of stories of what happened. It sounds like his idea of what Episode 9 should be just was not anyone else's idea at Disney. And August of 2017, he is gone. And it's literally like a day after they announced that he's gone that they announced that JJ's back.
J.J. Abrams is like a weird orbiter around this trilogy, because he kind of comes in and out. It feels like he's always trying to leave it, but he always gets pulled back in. Like, after J.J. Abrams, they kind of wanted to open up the franchises to, like George Lucas said in the beginning, new storytellers. But here we get to see, like, that's not the case with Disney, because they retreat back to J.J. Abrams.
I see it as opposite. I feel like, as a producer, he's probably really involved the entire time. I have a feeling, just because of the timing of this, that they had already gotten cold feet on The Last Jedi, if this is all going on. Because Rian Johnson Rian Johnson is writer and director on The Last Jedi. There are no one else on those credits for those positions. Which is unique amongst all of these Disney Star Wars films. I think they saw what his reaction to Force Awakens was, which we'll get into, and probably got scared even before there were some bad reactions.
The fact that we're already kind of like reshooting entire movies, shifting directors around, it's a very big warning sign for me. Because this still goes on to this day in many ways. Like, I feel like Disney jumped pretty headfirst into everything, because they were so focused about making back all that money as quickly as possible. We'll get into Last Jedi in a bit, but like, already seeing directors being forced to leave and being replaced with new directors, it's worrying.
Yeah, it's never a good sign. Look, sometimes things happen. It's, both business and creativity. So, you're going to get that at big studios, but it is bizarrely, disturbingly common in these projects right now. Even to now, we're going to keep going on that. Back around when the movie came out in December of 2017, I did publish an article kind of defending The Last Jedi. It hasn't held up as much in repeat viewings, and I'm the first to admit that. I do think there are things about The Last Jedi that actually are really smart reactions, but there is a lot of kind of poor reaction and just generally odd plot points in The Last Jedi.
I think beyond what... Because... Alright. If we're going to get into it, let's get into it. There was so much controversy around this film, mainly for what they did to Luke Skywalker, but even beyond that, there's a lot of just like weird decisions, but they do try to expand the world, but they always try to unexpand it at the same time. It was very... to ape a little bit of Red Letter Media's criticism, it's like they keep trying to untwist the plot twist. Because, like, they're trying to subvert your expectations. It's like, Star Wars is never about subverting your expectations, really. It's about just, like, telling a fun action film.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you're always going to go back to Vader being Luke's father as, like, the reason people are going to look for those twists. And it's a huge moment in the series. If you look at it from a plot point of view, it both is a twist and moves things along, which is why it's so effective, is because it's a twist and you probably didn't expect it if you didn't know that Vader was going to be Luke's father. But it also makes a lot of sense, so it progresses the story. Contrivance is part of making a plot interesting. But when you start doing it just for the sake of making things more confused, it doesn't work. That is 100% the Poe Dameron General Holdo thing. Like, it just doesn't make any sense.
There's a lot of people like criticize this movie for like kind of wheel spinning because the whole film basically starts where it ends where it starts. And where they're escaping the First Order and they were leaving the First Order in the beginning of the film. The Poe Dameron plot is a good example of that because in theory it makes sense that like Poe Dameron is a hotshot pilot and he probably would get kicked off for doing something stupid. But it comes off the back of, like, Princess Leia gliding through space back into the spaceship, and then her suddenly saying she's the general now, and she's the best general I ever know. And then it doesn't feel like she tells anybody the plan. And people say, well, yeah, of course, she doesn't have to tell Poe Dameron anything. He's just the pilot. But at the same time, he's kind of the second in command, weirdly enough. And I think that's a result of them not really expanding on, like, the military order in that, because you don't see many, like, other generals or anything.
I agree with you, but I think it's even worse than that. It literally makes no sense that she wouldn't tell him the plan, because all that's happening is her allies are getting killed.
Yeah.
The plan doesn't make any sense.
Because she's presented originally as, like, the best general. She was able to, like, have these people have hope all the way in some stronghold where they were getting bombarded, and she was able to pull everybody together. And here it doesn't seem like she pulls anybody together, because when the mutiny happens, it seems everybody betrays her. And at the same time, it's like, everybody's stuck on this ship, they're slowly getting squeezed out by the First Order. Like, they're just seeing their friends fucking die on the spaceships around them. It's a very weird situation, and like, sure, Poe would do something stupid, but the plan they come up with is very strange in and of itself.
Yeah, it just doesn't make any sense, and it feels like filler. And it is. I mean, there's no, like, what really results from that? Nothing. It's them trying to say, oh, Poe didn't understand this plan. Like, that's the only result you get, and it's supposed to be like, maybe he has this moment of revelation of, like, things are more complicated than I thought they were. But the problem is, her plan didn't hold any water.
Her plan was dumb. It was like, we'll retreat to another stronghold after we left another stronghold. Right. And it's like, you still have the First Order chasing you.
And everyone is dying.
Yeah.
We also get Finn and new character, Rose, riding space horses.
I like the space horses.
I mean, the horses are fine. That whole sequence was just another point of, why is this here?
Well, I guess my big problem is with the theming of it, because like I was saying in Force Awakens, is about dealing with the past. And The Last Jedi is very, very much about that. But it's very wishy-washy with, like, what it's trying to say. Because Rose, when she goes to that casino planet, she's like, you know, slavers are bad, I was a kid slave, and the resistance busted me out. But they never really go too much anywhere with that. The biggest example to me is when they're talking about, I was going to say spoilers, but I feel like everyone's already saw this film. It made $1.5 billion. Yeah,
I don't think I mean, if you are listening and you haven't watched these we're sorry. We're terribly sorry.
But, like, Luke is talking about, oh, I hate the Jedi. Jedi doesn't mean anything. It's kind of a stupid thing. And then the tree catches on fire and is going to burn the Jedi records. And he goes to try to save it. And Yoda's like, no, let them burn. So he lets them burn. And then they're on the ship. And you're like, wait, I thought the Jedi records weren't all that important. And then it's like, no, they were, because it cuts back to the slave kid on the casino planet, and he's doing a mock thing of the battle with Luke and Kylo Ren. So they're like, oh, I guess it's because the Jedi are, like, inspirational. You need them around.
I think because of that whole sequence of, like, you know, Finn's, like, B-plot there, I don't really associate the Luke-Rey plot with that, and we'll talk about that a little more extensively. But it is interesting you bring that up, that it is this sort of, like, cyclical logic of, oh no, you know, like, this isn't important. Oh yeah, it is. It's important, because remember, it was important before. But this is where I will defend Rian Johnson, and I have in the past. And you can read the article when you can see me liking the movie a little more than I do right now. Everything involved with, like, those Force characters, with Luke, Kylo Ren, Rey, works better than everything else in the movie. works better than anything else in Force Awakens. Because regardless of how happy you are with how Luke ended up, if that's what happened to everything, if the Republic collapsed, I think you would get a Luke like that.
Yeah, but it's weird because the Republic hasn't collapsed at this point. The Republic is still around. They're just, unable to deal with these weird mercenaries and raiders on the border.
Which is another problem with the film, is still, in the second film of the trilogy, we have no idea what's going on. We have to assume that 95% of the audience is not paying any attention to any of the outside media. They just want to go see the next movie. That kills that momentum, because we still don't know what the First Order is. Most people still have no idea what that whole concept is supposed to be. And quite honestly, even if you do, you can watch those movies and understand that if you just watch movies, you would have no clue what was going on. Maybe that's why I end up grasping onto the Rey, Luke, Kylo Ren stuff in that movie so much.
It is the best part, until it gets to the throne room sequence.
Where he kills Snoke?
Yeah. Because I guess that whole scene where it's Kylo Ren kills Snoke, it holds him that, idea for, 5 minutes. You're like, oh, he's going to kill Snoke. Is he going to kill Snoke? They're holding on this for a very long time. No, he's definitely going to kill Snoke. Is he? Because this has been, 4 minutes of him talking. And it's, very weird and cyclical, and then he does kill Snoke, and you're like, alright, now what? That's interesting. What's going to happen now? Snoke's dead. And then it just dissolves into, a fight. And then it's Kylo Ren and Rey standing in that spaceship, and they're like, let's build something new, because the past, we had to abandon the past. Which is something that builds upon from, A Force Awakens. But then it says, no, let's just go back to the First Order.
You know what's funny? I have the opposite opinion of that. I think that's Rian Johnson, fighting through all of, the film bureaucracy that he's had to deal with making this movie, and going, you know what? You left me in this position where I have very little to work with. So my whole goal here is to wipe the slate. And I think that's the point that he's trying to make is, when Kylo Ren says that, Rey came from, nothing. Whether or not that gets contradicted in the next film, which I'm sure it will.
I'm not looking forward to that.
I think that was a valid point. Is if you're saying Return of the Jedi was meaningless, if you're saying that all the work that these other characters put in to save everybody didn't work, you make a movie that is basically trying to copy everything those movies did. This is Johnson turning around and going you left me with nothing new to work with. You left me with nothing innovative. So I have to tear down this entire thing to try to get it to somewhere.
But then the problem is I'm fine with him wiping the slate clean. He can kill Leia, Han Solo, Luke. Fine. That's fine with me. But the problem is that what he does with all what remains is not all that interesting. Because he just dissolves it into, Rey and Kylo Ren fighting again. And it's just, again, a battle from good versus evil. It's not because they talk a lot about, the dark side of the Force not really be dark. It's it's not evil, it's just a force.
Right, and that the fact that, the Jedi Order, while they did do a lot of good, ultimately got caught up in their own bureaucracy. And
right, which is something in the prequels, is something in all the EU lore. Not European Union, Extended Universe lore. It's in all of that, and that's the more interesting thing to deal with. But then he doesn't deal with it.
And then it does reset to, now we're just the rebellion against the Empire again at the end of the movie.
Right.
But, once again, Kylo Ren comes out of the movie the best as everyone else, where he now has completely turned his back on the light side of the Force, whatever we want to say. Which I think is also going to end up changing in the next one. But, like I said, I think those sequences are where Rian Johnson tried to make a statement. Whether he was successful or not, it's debatable. But I think he tried to push it in a direction that I don't think we're going to go in. That I can't imagine Abrams even attempting.
And I think that's the shame of the film, because despite all its weird pacing problems, all its flaws, it introduces a lot of interesting things that audience would not have known about before. This thing about life and death in the universe. That's interesting. That's something you can actually conceptualize and deal with and have something more than just Empire versus Rebellion. But then that doesn't happen.
And it's funny, you always wonder, did Johnson know that? And is that why is that the end of the movie? Is because he had to make his statement and he knew it wasn't going to stick, so he had to stick it in the middle of things instead of putting it at the very, very end, because the very end he knew he wasn't going to have control over?
Yeah, that's possible, because as we'll see later on with Han Solo, there's a lot of weird behind-the-scenes stuff going on with the Star Wars movies. I would be remiss not to mention the weird scene at the end with Rose flying straight into the laser cannon for some reason.
Yeah, no, there's just a lot of bizarre... And, like, the thing is, Crate is, like, one of the coolest things in the entire, like, Star Wars canon, like, visually, with, like, the red salt kicking up and, like...
Yeah.
And while, yes, it does have that sort of mirror to Hoth, I thought they did really cool stuff with it, and it almost felt like, oh, you thought this was just going to be Hoth? Well, this is a little different. Which, you know, I guess isn't the most creative thing in the world either, but it's still really cool looking. And it's another use for giant walkers, which you don't get to use too much.
Yeah, and they bring down the Death Star cannon, which is so ridiculous it's funny and cool.
The Last Jedi might be, out of the ones that aren't great, the most interesting.
Yeah, it is the most interesting because it introduces so much from the extended universe. But then you have the problem where the extended universe feels a lot more thought out. Like, when you have stuff like the Mandalorians invading the Old Republic, there feels like a reason behind it. And it's basically because the Mandalorians are like space barbarians, and the Old Republic is kind of like a failing system, and they can't deal with all these weird space barbarians coming out of nowhere. And it feels like it sounds stupid, but it kind of makes sense.
It leaves things in at least a different place than Force Awakens did. But in May of 2018, May 25th to be exact, they released Solo, a Star Wars story, the second of these Star Wars anthology films. This one is where you see a lot of that ugliness we were just talking about. You get Lord and Miller are brought on, who are very successful in many other projects.
Mainly animation. They did the producers in Spider-Verse that helped direct some of that. They were mainly known for Clone High, which is a brilliant show, and the Lego Movie.
So they come on to do a script that had been worked on for a very long time, apparently, and that the studio was very happy with. They start making some choices while they're shooting it, and it seems that the driving force that was mentioned in a bunch of interviews, and I shouldn't say interviews, a bunch of articles I read on it, is that they weren't shooting enough alternate versions of things to try to appease the studio, so the studio felt like they could have a little more control over the film. Eventually, they're kind of pushed out. Ron Howard takes over, supposedly reshoots about 70% of the movie. So the movie that we end up with is really a Ron Howard movie. I think you can say that with fair confidence. And they decide to sort of exit as directors and take executive producer credits on it. Solo does not do incredibly well.
I think all the rumors around this film really hurt it. And beyond that, I'm not dying to see a Han Solo prequel story. What they came out with was cool, but it's just something I didn't feel was necessary. And I think that was the audience's reaction too, is like, I think people got a taste of it, what they were going to get with Rogue One, and they didn't want it again with Han Solo, because Han Solo's in this weird iconography of film. It's just like making an Indiana Jones prequel. It's like no one cares about an Indiana Jones prequel. He's so big that you kind of know everything about him, and being able to fill in the blanks for yourself is what makes him so appealing.
And it's funny, as much as I like Rogue One, I even agree with that opinion a little bit too, that, the audience was satiated. Like, even if they wanted that, do you really need it again? Now, does that make it a bad movie? No, I actually really like Solo. I think Solo is super underrated, and I have a feeling as time passes and it just becomes part of this big canon, people are just going to accept it and enjoy it. But I think you're right. I think the public perception was, why are we getting, all this Star Wars all the time? Why are you telling a story that no one really asked for? And also, like you said, a little bit of bad press there. A little bit of, oh, this movie's all screwed up. Which, ultimately, I don't think it was. I think there are a couple of plot points that, I think are a little silly, but if anything that's really cool is it ties everything directly to the continuity establishing Clone Wars, with Darth Maul not being dead. By the way, he's not dead, I'm sorry, if you didn't see any of these. He is eventually dead. I thought it was, once again, just like Rogue One, that sort of EU tone. But I think you're correct. I think there was no fervor in the public for it. No one really was super excited about it, and even the people who liked it were kind of like, okay.
Yeah, and there was no fervor in the production either. The fact Ron Howard came on is a very mercenary decision, because Ron Howard is a very direct director, to mangle my words.
I like the director.
He doesn't do anything too exciting. He kind of does basically what he's told. And he's
Have you seen Willow?
Not many people have.
Oh, jeez. Man, now I feel old. Willow is exciting.
I was planning on watching on Disney Plus.
Don't listen to Christian. Willow is very exciting. You should watch it on Disney Plus. It's great.
And then I think people kind of got the perception, like, because Phil Lord and Christopher Miller were kicked off, we got this lesser version of a film.
Which I don't think we did. I think we got a really good film.
See, the only part, I feel like this is my criticism of most Star Wars films, like, it's the middle I'm not happy with.
Okay.
Because, like, in the middle you have that train heist sequence, and, like, half the crew dies. Well, the entire crew dies, really. And you're kind of like, I just spent, like, 45 minutes with these characters. Why are they gone all of a sudden?
I don't know. I don't think that necessarily impacts it negatively. I think the end where, Han Solo, who supposedly wanted nothing to do with the rebellion, basically started funding the rebellion, was a little silly. But there's too much that I like about it. And I think people are gonna get mad at me for forgetting the name of the droid. But the droid who becomes the Millennium Falcon, I thought a little bit of that was like, alright, we get it. But for the most part, I thought the idea was cool, and I thought the idea of having, like, real Ralph McQuarrie-looking Wookiees, like, populating the mines was really cool. There's just a lot of cool stuff in it. And I actually like the retconned early what the Millennium Falcon is supposed to look like. I thought was really cool.
This neat idea, isn't it? I feel like it expands a lot more in the lore, too, because you do get this sense of, like, early Empire, where there's all this propaganda everywhere, and the way they treat people and everything, I feel like it expands a bit more in the lore than, like, Rogue One did. Where Rogue One kind of, like, created an atmosphere, this actually created a bit more of a continuity.
So the next project that comes up after Solo is Star Wars Resistance. Not connected with the Clone Wars production team. Does use a 3D animation style. Generally a little goofier than anything on Clone Wars or Rebels, which is saying a lot, because Clone Wars could get pretty goofy.
Yeah, I remember the planet where they actually had ghosts and everything.
Yeah, there's ghosts, and there's, like, entire, like, 3-episode arcs of just about droids.
Or they literally have, like, they give Darth Maul the spooky castle and everything. They literally call it Darth Maul's castle.
Yeah, it's, but Resistance, Resistance is what it is. It's a show that is, I think, in my opinion, hindered by what I said earlier, that, the prequel trilogy gave a good base to work off of with specifics. The Resistance First Order era does not, and Star Wars Resistance suffers because of it. It's not poorly written. It looks pretty cool. There's a lot of cool concepts in it, but it's hard for it to really take hold of anything.
I think a lot of it's also hamstringed by corporate, where corporate's still not really sure what direction they want to go in, so they're saying, don't go in any direction.
Right.
Until we decide what direction we want to go in. Well, you have to make the show.
Yeah, we have to have Star Wars things, but don't overcommit. Probably the biggest Star Wars thing, I'm going to say since Force Awakens, has been Disney Plus's Mandalorian, which launched in November.
I wouldn't say the biggest thing since Force Awakens. Force Awakens had such a weird media hype around it, where it was like, you can get to share Star Wars with your kids now. You're passing Star Wars on to your kids.
Well, I would say, that's why I say since. I don't think, the build-up to Force Awakens, regardless of the result, was something very, special, because they played it as this whole restoring thing. They used that Marvel playbook, where they're, this character's showing up here now. Now it's important. They played it very similar to that, but The Mandalorian is getting, really good reviews, and a lot of fans, myself included, really enjoy it.
I didn't enjoy it at first, but episode 4 turned my opinion around. Because the first 3 episodes, I could feel the filler. Where the Mandalorian's, trying to ride the dogfish horse in the first episode. Why am I wasting 10 minutes on him watching him ride the dogfish horse?
Can I tell you something funny? I have the inverse opinion. I love the first 3 episodes. I think they're really cool. I think they're really westerny, which is what I want. And then the 4th one was Seven Samurai, which comes up a lot. And I don't dislike it. And I think there's things in it that are really cool. But it was my least favorite of the episodes that have been released as we're recording this. There's another one tomorrow as we're recording this, so.
See, I like the 4th one because it gives him more character. And then, the first 3, he's not really talking to anybody. So, those first 3 episodes are very Clint Eastwood, where you have, a guy kind of bouncing around doing bounty hunter things. But my problem with it is that usually in Clint Eastwood movies, they're very much more focused. There's not as much as like him staying in a town. It's him always on the move. And I don't feel like the plot kicks in until he actually gets Baby Yoda. And I think those first 3 episodes work really well together if you watch them all at once. Because it does feel like a movie that cut up into 3 parts.
I don't disagree with that. I think, yeah, it does. They are very connected and they do work better in succession. I do disagree a little bit that, you get the Baby Yoda, whatever it's going to be called. The Child, I think, is the official going name right now.
It's Baby Yoda.
They got to mark. They can't call him Baby Yoda because he's not Yoda. We know he's not Yoda. I thought it was actually paced out really well, and I thought the idea of making sure it was by making your episodes however the hell long you want them to be was helpful in that. 4, I get what you're saying about, like, developing him as a character a little more. But I think part of the point of the first 3 is he is this weapon until you get to the end of episode 3. Like, that he wasn't really thinking about those things, and that's why he has that struggle at the end of episode 3. And you're right, run them through together, it's even better. But I didn't think there was any problems with it.
No, it just, for me, is like the pacing just felt off. Because even though you said, like, in that first episode it's an hour long, and then the next 2 are, like, 25 minutes long, I still feel like in episode, like, 2 and 1, there's moments where they just had to, like, well, we gotta, like, pad out 5 more minutes. Because it gotta hit, like, around the hour mark or something.
I don't know. I disagree. I think the type of storytelling they were going for justifies it. It's, you're always playing that game of if you're trying to conform to a style, how far do you go with it? I think they went in the right places to like that Western idea. And it's very much a Western TV show in that sense, too, because you do get endings.
Yeah.
Like, your ending to the episode is an ending of the episode, which is nice. It's refreshing. As much as there is good serialized storytelling on television, having a little bit of a break is nice because for the last 10 years, that's what we've watched. I guess we'll do a little theorizing here. Up next, and shortly after you listen to this, hopefully, will come out Star Wars The Rise of Skywalker, which I hate that title, on December 20th, 2019. Ultimately credited on this are Derek Connolly, Colin Trevorrow, which were that original team that were going to work on the film, J.J. Abrams, and Chris Terrio, who wrote Batman vs. Superman and the lauded, lost Snyder cut of Justice League.
I don't know if it's lauded. No one's seen it.
There are people who've seen it. People have seen it. You know it exists. Come on, Warner Brothers. You know it exists.
The Rise of Skywalker will be interesting because I think it will be either the life or death of this franchise. Or at least the big tentpole Star Wars movie franchise they want to do. Because it's impossible to kill Star Wars. It's a American culture icon at this point.
I totally agree with that. I don't think Star Wars is going anywhere no matter what. I think the impact that this could have is if it is not well received or it is kind of middling, I don't think we see a numbered episode Star Wars for 20 years. And I mean that. I think Star Wars from this point on, I think Star Wars might already almost all be streaming television property because of how well The Mandalorian is performing and because of how much easier it is to tell those type of stories than it is to try to do what they did, which is recapture this magic that no one has. The original trilogy is the original trilogy. The prequels are what they are, and we talked about how, time has been pretty kind to them, but no one looks at those movies the same way they look at the original 3. And I don't think there's any way at this point to have this trilogy be viewed any better than the prequels.
No way.
I don't think so. I don't think you can do it in one movie.
So you think this is going to be worse received than the prequels?
Ultimately, I think it's totally possible, yeah.
Wow, alright. Because for me, the prequels are so, stilted, it's impossible to connect with them in any way, besides, theoretical lore ways. I feel like in the Disney series, we'll at least get characters that I can say, I like Finn, I like Rey, I like Rose.
And that's still entirely anchored by if this goes anywhere in this movie.
Yeah, I mean, all of them could die at the Rise of Skywalker. The only ideas I have is that I think Skywalker is going to become, a title, much like Darth is a title. So the good Jedis would be called Skywalkers, and the bad Jedis would be called Darths, or whatever.
Oh, boy.
But,
or maybe all Force wielders will just be Skywalkers.
That's possible, too.
Then you'll have kids 20 years later going, they can't walk on the sky. Like, I mean, in continuity. Like, in the Star Wars world, like, the universe, they would be
why
like...
is he called Skywalker?
Why are they called Skywalkers? Jedi made more sense. It was just a name.
But, like, that's the only theory I have, because it seems like so much of it is, like, we'll bring back Palpatine, who I don't think is a great character in the first place. He's a good villain, but he's not, like, a rich villain in any feasible way.
I think he's, a completely reasonable villain.
Yeah.
And I think, he is a character who was improved by the prequels, because you have an idea of how he got into that position, and the massive amount of manipulation that he was performing that led to the utter corruption of the Empire.
Which is the interesting thing. But here, like, he's probably, like, is he a Force ghost? Maybe. Or was he alive the whole time? Which might be what they're going to go with, which is incredibly stupid.
He just fell down that hole and he was okay.
Yeah, like he's Walt Disney, just frozen in, like, some cryo chamber, like Walt Disney underneath the theme parks.
That is not true.
You don't know that.
I don't know for sure, but I'm pretty sure.
It kind of seems like a lot of these actors are going to make a clean break from the Star Wars series after this, because from far as I can tell, it's been a massive strain on them.
It's got to be, first of all, stressful to even be put in that position. Like, whether, you're taking the money or not, how much criticism is going to be waged on you.
And you personally, for the decisions you didn't even make.
Right.
And it's like, and then that sticks with you. For example, like Twilight movies. Only just now is like all those actors from the Twilight movies just getting rid of the stigma, and it's been like 10 years.
And I don't think that stigma's entirely gone. I think once we have a trailer for the Batman, that stigma's gonna rear its ugly head again.
Oh yeah, it's already been rearing its ugly head. And then you have like Kristen Stewart, like she still gets criticized for that, and like Charlie's Angels, which is a whole other thing.
There will not be a podcast on Charlie's Angels. I just will put that out there.
But, like, I can't imagine anybody walking away from this film, or at least from the production, happy.
As time has gone on, the kind of stakes of that have changed. The original crew were hopping onto what they thought was like a kid's movie that, maybe no one would see. The prequel trilogy, to Lucas's credit, he picked a pretty intriguing cast of, like, up-and-comers, most of whom became very successful, which changes the nature of it, too. I don't know where this crew is going. I mean, they could all become very big names in the future.
I think they will. I feel, like, the guy that plays Finn, he's very charismatic. I was pretty impressed with how he plays off of everybody in those movies.
So what do you think, let's throw this out there, do a little, since we're speculating anyway. Do you think Matt Smith is in this movie? Because he sure says he isn't, but all those rumors were that he shot for it.
I think he is in this. Yeah, he might be just a cameo. Who knows? I think it's probably like be butchered in editing this film, but I think he will show up.
All right. Rise of Skywalker is a make or break moment for this trilogy. I don't know if it can completely save it, regardless of how good it is. You're already getting a lot of criticism on the amount of humor in the trailers.
Oh my god. They have jetpacks.
Which they would have had in continuity. That was bothering me in my head. I'm like, clone troopers had jetpacks. We know that.
And I think the lack of like how much we're seeing, like before The Last Jedi came out, there were so many porgs.
Right.
But like here we have nothing.
Yeah. The merchandising definitely has changed, which it could be an indicator of faith or lack thereof in the film.
Or like secrecy.
Right.
Because I think Marvel learned a lot of hard lessons from that.
But this will not be the last thing we get in the near future anyway. In the future, we are getting a Cassian Andor series for Disney+, taking place before Rogue One, which is kind of a cool concept.
I'd be enjoying seeing like spy adventures, because I think Cassian Andor had the most to work with out of all those characters. I don't think most of them got developed in Rogue One.
Yeah, it's, where he starts in Rogue One, he's pretty hard-edged, which could be cool for a TV show. We're also getting the Obi-Wan series, which sounds pretty cool.
Yeah, I'm not super excited for it, though, because I can only imagine it as, like, a mirror to, like, Anakin's story. Because I guess it depends where they actually pick up Obi-Wan with.
Do you think it's just going to be him planning all of his lies?
Yes, it's him with like a corkboard pinning everything up, and
I'll say his father wanted him to have this. The Rian Johnson trilogy that would not be numbered is apparently not off the table.
Which is interesting, because it feels like Disney has more or less completely backed away from Rian Johnson.
But we'll see, because they did say there were going to be more Star Wars movies, just not as quick a turnaround. So maybe there is something we don't know. Johnson, in a recent interview, said that he wasn't even sure. So, you know.
Which sounds like Star Wars at this point.
Yeah. The rumor that's going around is we know that there were supposed to be more solo films. The cast had all signed for like 3 movies. What has been the rumor going around, and I have no reason to doubt it, it sounds pretty realistic, is that this would have fleshed out where Kira ends up and fleshed out the whole underworld pre A New Hope. One of the rumors that is getting a lot of steam and has popped up in a lot of places that have gotten good scoops is that following Obi-Wan, there's going to be a Darth Maul series that's going to essentially take the plot points that they were going to play out in Solo and play it out in that.
That'd be interesting because I feel like Darth Maul has been expanded pretty heavily upon since Phantom Menace, especially his race too. There's a lot of weird things to work with that. And that also opens the door to play with the Han Solo stuff. I can't imagine it being solely Darth Maul focused, but I imagine it being kind of like pre-Empire focused.
And one of the interesting things is the cast of Solo, well-known actors at this point, but no one huge. Not unreasonable to say that they might show up in that show as, you might get a young Han Solo showing up again. You might get a young Lando showing up again. I could certainly see them doing a lot with Kira on a show like that. A lot of potential there. The one thing that no longer has any potential is David Benioff and D.B. Weiss's trilogy that was announced and then canceled because they had to go work at Netflix, supposedly.
Which is weird because that's what they said when they left Game of Thrones, is that they had to work on Star Wars, and now they're saying we have to work at Netflix. So I don't know if it's a lack of commitment on their part or the lack of commitment on Disney's part.
Yeah, I mean...
Because HBO was pretty infamous about saying, like, we can give you, 15 seasons. We don't care. Please just make more Game of Thrones. And They said no. Yeah,
it's an interesting situation. I can't help but wonder if maybe it had something to do with the poor reaction to the last season of Game of Thrones.
Rarely do you see something so infamously reviled. Across the board.
And, we typically don't cover things we don't like. And even I had to write something about the last season of Game of Thrones. It was just, go read the article. It's on the site. I don't feel like getting into it. I'll get frustrated. Outside of all the comics and the books and the children's audiobooks and toys, that's really where we are with Star Wars right now.
It's interesting to see how Disney has tried to adapt Star Wars, because I feel like a lot of what Disney's trying to do is that even though they're trying to introduce new ideas, it feels like a lot of it's retreating to the original trilogy or retreating to parts of the prequel.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And that's what I'm kind of afraid of at the end of The Rise of Skywalker, is we're going to have a trilogy of movies that really didn't do anything. And, as happy as I am to consume products about, what happened before, during, and after the original trilogy, with all of that, power and money and production value that Disney has, I really, really wished that their numbered trilogy was really going to, push Star Wars into something interesting.
It's interesting to see this with, the Marvel movies, because with Marvel movies, we talked about this on our podcast before, the early Marvel movies were pretty much a mess, just trying to establish some kind of continuity. But they had the ability to just, wait 2 or 3 years between films. Here, they were so committed about releasing something every year, it feels like they shot themselves in the foot. Because they were we just had to release something. It doesn't have to be good, it's just something.
Yeah, and oddly enough, the ones that you would think they would focus... the projects that you would think would get less attention are the ones that kind of turned out better, maybe because the oversight wasn't as confused.
I feel like if you Rian Johnson $400 million, you have to be pretty confident in his vision. And then if you give somebody like $200 million, that shows a lack of faith in the original concept to begin with.
I guess. Oh, you know what we did forget? We did forget one thing. They're bringing back Clone Wars on Disney Plus too.
I guess.
Apparently to fill in some of the things they couldn't do in Rebels that they wanted to do at the end of Clone Wars. Because a lot of Rebels became Clone Wars. Well, anyway, you know what? We're going to get out of this before we remember 5 other things. Please subscribe, comment, wherever you happen to listen to this. If you are listening to this in one place, we are available on most major podcast platforms, and you can find us all over social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and Vero. Yeah. Vero.
At Dissecting Fiction, just look up Dissecting Fiction on your favorite platforms, and we'll be there.
Yeah, we'll pretty much be there. Unless your favorite platforms 4chan or something.
Don't post us to 4chan, please.
Yeah, we don't have Reddit. Well, anyway, I'm Vinny Murphy.
I'm Christian Cutlick.
And thanks for listening.
Bye.